Good morning and welcome to Ridge's Fall 2015 virtual tasting. Our apologies for the technical delays. Hopefully you've been able to make the switch over to YouTube and you're viewing the tasting with us now this morning. Normally we handle this through live stream, but for some reason they chose this morning to have technical difficulties, and we've now made the switch over to YouTube, and hopefully you've been able to make the switch with us. My name's David Amadia. I'm in charge of the sales and marketing here at the winery, and today it's my pleasure to host the virtual tasting. This morning we're coming to you live from our Lytton Springs winery in the Dry Creek Valley. Behind us is our old vines, planted over a century ago in 1901. So this morning here in California we'll be tasting with you 5 wines, all from our fall release. And the wines in tasting order, I'll just quickly go through them for you. Hopefully you haven't finished them yet. The 13 Ponzo Zinfandel, 2013 Lytton Springs, 2013 Pagani Ranch Zinfandel. The 4th wine is the Lytton Estate Petite Sirah, and the 5th wine is our 2012 Monte Bello. This is an interactive event, and we really thrive on your questions and comments. If you have any questions or comments now, please feel free to send them through on the chat function. YouTube as well has a chat function, or you can send your comments or questions to the email address wholesale@ridgewine.com. All of those will be coming through to me, and I will be more than pleased to pass those questions and comments on to our team. Perfect segue. Joining us today are the 4 key members of our production and winemaking team, and let me take a moment just to introduce them to you. Immediately to my left is John Olney. John is our Vice President of Winemaking in charge of this facility, Lytton Springs. John joined Ridge in 1996, and he's in his 19th year here at the winery. Immediately to John's left is Eric Baugher. Eric is Vice President of Winemaking of our Monte Bello winery in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Joined Ridge in 1994, and Eric is in his 21st year with Ridge. At the far end of the table, down there, is David Gates. David's our farmer. He's Vice President of Vineyard Operations. Joined Ridge in 1989, in the 80s, wow. And he's in his 26th year here at Ridge. And in the middle of the pack there is Paul Draper. Paul is our head of winemaking and our CEO. Paul joined Ridge in 1969, and he's in his 46th year with Ridge Vineyards. I'd like to thank the panel for being with us this morning. Thank you for being with us. Obviously, it's a busy time for us here at the winery. John just finished up crushing his last grape here at Lytton Springs on Tuesday, and we have about 10 days more of picking and crushing to do at Monte Bello. And perhaps that's the perfect segue to make a few comments about the observations and the early take on the 2015 harvest, and maybe I'll ask Paul to kick off that conversation.
Well, a few words first that we're here at Lytton Springs because 3 out of the 5 wines John made here at Lytton Springs. So that's the focus. The earliest beginning to harvest ever, I think, certainly here at Lytton and then at Geyserville. And not quite at Monte Bello. Monte Bello luckily was
it's early, but yeah, just not by about a week and a half later than.
On the other hand, the finish is going to be one of the earliest as well. And that was basically due to warm weather and starting in February. Mm-hmm. And for all of California, talk to David, we've all been talking, that for all of California, it's going to be a short crop. And the reason mainly is that May, we had this very cold weather that interfered with flowering and then set. So it cut us back here at Lytton by 30%. Yeah, probably. At Geyserville, 25. 25%. 25% at Monte Bello. A good, what did we say, 20?
Well, 35% was Chard. Yeah, for the cabs, I think once we're done, we'll probably see that we're down about 20%.
So this is probably the most, for us and for California in general, probably going to be the most serious loss of quantity that we've seen. On the other hand, for us, and I think for everybody in California that we've heard from, the quality is just superb. Concentration of fewer grapes, smaller berries, smaller clusters, really has given California a great vintage. Now, that's got to be proved out. But on the other hand, the serious thing is, quality for us is more important than quantity. On the other hand, to survive as a business, we've got to have a certain amount of quantity.
Yes.
So this is a serious year for us.
Absolutely.
But with that, John, why don't we go into the Ponzo?
Sure. Our first wine is the 2013 Zinfandel from the Ponzo Vineyard, single vineyard in the Russian River. It's our only vineyard actually in the Russian River. We've been making the wine for about a little over 10 years now. And 2013 was, I guess in thinking back, was really the first real dry winter we had, and that was sort of the kickoff to what's now the drought. So we had really early bud break, and it was actually, in terms of degree days and how much heat we had, 2013 was up there.
Record,
yeah. But we didn't really have so many heat spikes, and it really made for excellent growing conditions for the vine. So we had a long growing season, and with the Ponzo, it always has that very sort of almost exotic floral sort of nose to it, and that really came out in 2013, I think.
This is a smaller production wine. It's a wine that doesn't make it to a national release every year. I believe the 12 was not a national release, the 13 is. So somewhat of a challenge in terms of, from a sales perspective, that it's a come and go wine. But it's a very distinctive wine in our portfolio, I think. It has a really distinctive terroir of the Russian River, and it really has a place. I mean, it really is a unique wine in the portfolio.
Yeah, and I think, when we look at some of the other Zinfandels we have here, and many that we make, a lot of our, Zinfandels, can have quite a bit of structure to them, and, really merit laying down for a bit. The Ponzo, I think the Paso Robles a little bit in the same way is much more approachable, so it sort of fits a nice nice spot.
And maybe to follow on what you said about 12 and 13 in the drought years, we were just discussing the fact that in these 4 years of drought, the two vintages where we've really seen an effect have been 12 and 15. That in fact 13 and 14 really did do pretty well in terms of not only fantastic quality, but in quantity as well. So it's been 12 that first year of the drought, and now 15 because of that cold May weather, that really we've seen yields down all over California.
And David, we had a question about the vine age at Ponzo. There's some conflicting information out there about vine age, and I know there are different ages out in the field there. So what are we working with at Ponzo?
Well, the oldest block, we call it the old block.
Okay,
old vines.
creative.
Yeah, very creative. We're working on it. They're planted in the 50s, and that is mostly Zinfandel. Really a good selection of Zin, with the first 8 rows of the block all the way across are Petite Sirah, but within that Petite Sirah there's a little bit of, like you usually see in old Petite Sirah vineyards, a little bit of Pelersan and a little bit of Syrah, which are, coincidentally or not, the two parents of Petite Sirah. Also within that, the Zin vines, there are a few other varieties, but mostly Zin. So that's kind of the heart of the Ponzo. Then there's a little block in the front, which, appropriately we call the front block, that is actually cordon trained. So it's it's up on a good high cordon with kind of a modified California sprawl trellis system, so it gets enough shade, which really helps that Zinfandel here in Sonoma County. Those vines are 100% Zin, and that is a Dry Creek clone of Zinfandel, or selection of Zinfandel. Okay. And then the youngest vines are in the back of the ranch, and I won't tell you the name of that block, but I'm sure you can guess. And that is also, those are a little bit younger. They're about 15 years old now.
On cordon as well?
Also on cordon, and so
they didn't go in 13.
They did not make it in 13. They made it in 14, and they might in 15.
Yeah, they're coming along so beautifully. But in the past, John's held them out, or much of them out, in the Ponzo. Yeah.
So if we're playing Ridge Trivial Pursuit, are these the only Zin vines we harvest that are on cordon?
Up until this year, yeah.
Okay.
We have an ATP or
It's
Rhodes.
Rhodes, yeah.
Oh, Rhodes is on
So
cordon.
we have
Oh,
a new vineyard up in Mendocino that is partially on cordon. But yes, good question. We don't believe in cordon basically, but you know it's done well at Ponzo.
It works if the yields are managed.
Yeah.
So Paul, you've mentioned the drought a couple of times. We have a question about, and maybe David, you can weigh in as well, on farming practices relative to the drought, and what are we doing differently in the vineyard as a result?
Oh, the main thing is a renewed focus. I think we touched on this a little bit in the spring, but a renewed focus on weed control. So weeds are really compete quite a bit with moisture in the soil for the vines in the spring. And California having a very dry summer, those weeds will eventually die out. But in a wet year, you want to keep them green as long as possible because they help limit the vigorousness of the vines. But in a dry year, you need to eliminate that competition. So we're in the vineyards early and often weeding, basically.
Okay.
And then we also learned a little lesson from last year where the vines made it to the harvest okay, but in fact they were really pushed to their limits. So we found that some of the fermentations weren't as robust as we wanted, and it was a nutrient problem. So this spring we did an early irrigation, very small irrigation, but an early irrigation on most of our blocks with a little bit of fertilizer, extra fertilizer. That really helped the vines out this year.
Yeah, we saw in the fermenters. I mean, this year the fermentations have been really nice.
Interesting.
So in a year where we don't have enough moisture in the soil, enough rainfall to for the microbes in the soil to break down the organic matter that we incorporate in the soil, and then that will, once they do that, that slowly releases nutrients to the vines. In dry years, there aren't as many microbes because they need moisture to live, and so you need to supplement that a little bit.
Okay.
So,
We've been doing cover cropping
Yes.
for 50 years, and also non-irrigation after the root systems are established, which takes about 8 to 10 years. But once you've got the deep irrigations driving those roots down,
Right.
we're one of the few vineyards that basically don't irrigate. Now here in the drought, we've had to step in, as David just said, here in the 4th year of the drought.
Right.
But in general, we haven't. And we assume as we go back to normal rainfall, which we hope happens,
Yes.
we'll be back to virtually dry farming entirely. So it really, except for young vines, they need that 10 years of deep irrigations to get their roots down.
But it sounds like we've made some significant adjustments as a result of the drought.
there's
Yes.
a saying in farming, adapt or die.
Okay. That's in life in general.
Yeah,
David.
Can be applied elsewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay,
Well,
John.
why don't we move to the second wine, which is obviously made here at Lytton Springs. It's our Lytton Springs Zinfandel. So, John, why don't you kick that one off for us, too?
Sure. So, definitely a shift coming away from the Ponzo to a wine that, as always, has a little more structure to it, darker fruit, a little more briary fruit. And, it was the heart of the wine, as usual, is sort of right behind us from the old vines. And when we brought in some of the Zinfandel from Lytton West, it really brought the fruit up. It's really great fruit expression in a 13. I think the wine's, it's a young wine right now. I think it'll be even better, 6 months from now. But really some great concentration, I think, on the palate. Really nice year, 13.
It is.
And that structure back there is
Oh, it's
just,
ageable.
yeah.
So I think, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about from when you're sharing this wine on release. This wine was just released in the U.S. market September 1st. If you're taking this out, sharing it with customers, double decant this wine. Obviously, it's going to show much better with a little more oxygen, a double decant, and that's really going to soften those tannins and make the wine more approachable and enjoyable. So just a tip, particularly with the Lytton Springs, I think that would be advantageous. Yeah. anything? I mean, all the Zins are from the 13 vintage. What would you say was the defining about the 13 vintage, David, in terms of Zinfandel?
Well, for me, the wines across the board in 13 are this neat combination of they have this liveliness to them, so really good acidity, but also something going on in the nose, but they also have enough opulence that they're easy, easier drinking perhaps than the 12. They seem to be more interesting. Immediately interesting. Absolutely, I like that.
They're pretty wines.
Absolutely.
And structured too. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
They're going to be really a good vintage to collect and age.
Yeah, the 12s and the 13s, both warmer vintage biz, but without the heat spikes,
Yeah.
long,
Water
pretty,
stress.
yeah,
small
concentrations,
berries, tiny clusters,
yeah,
but good yields. Well, or decent yields. I mean, you could always use more, but
And how do you compare 12 versus 13? Very, very similar, or lots of differences?
I've seen the 12s a little bit more elegant.
Okay.
Good fruit at the front of the palate, and then just nice, sensuous.
Another year of drought, Eric, you think, just adding to more concentration,
Or
or
we've seen it, 12s, 13, and then the 14s that are in the cellar now just take it up another level of concentration. And then these 15s are just unreal.
So just a
Right.
stair
I
step.
think the 13s
Yeah.
had just that little,
Just a little bit more
added amount
dimension
of
to them.
ripeness to them that really gives them the opulence
Yeah.
that was mentioned.
Okay. Well, good. Well, let's move on to our third wine then, which is the 13 Pagani Ranch. Eric, this is a wine you make at Monte Bello.
It's one of those opulent wines.
Yeah, certainly
So
stands out.
It was really the last. Well, it's a cool region, Sonoma Valley, where this vineyard's located. It was the last grapes crushed that year, and sampled, and as typical. I mean, in sampling, you always get a slight different reading than what you actually end up when you crush the grapes in the fermenter. And here we ended up with some pretty ripe grapes.
Okay.
They soaked out and produced a really big, rich Zinfandel. And in fermenting out, it went out 8 days in the fermenter. We worked the skins, extracted good color. This is a beautiful field-blended vineyard, and there's also a tiny parcel of Alicante, which I was able to bring in, crush, and kind of add a little bit to each fermenter to bring in some nice deep color. But as it fermented 8 days, it kind of stopped, and then we pressed off just because we were really starting to get some big tannins.
Okay.
So we pressed sweet and assembled, and in the end had this really deep, rich, slightly sweet wine that went to barrel. And when we first barreled it down, it was at 2.5% sugar, which
Wow.
was pretty serious. But then that spring, the yeast in barrel started getting active again and burnt through that sugar and took it down quite a bit. But there's still just a little bit of sweetness. But the great thing is this is also a really high acid site.
Yeah.
So you've got acid, big structure, and it really helps incorporate that sweetness.
It's super attractive.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it. And I mean, it certainly is distinctive from the rest of the lineup of the Zinfandels that we
Yeah.
made in 13. And there's certainly people who are going to love this wine.
Yeah, no, it's definitely fruit forward and opulent.
And
Yeah.
the ripeness balanced by the acidity,
Yeah.
it makes it more approachable, say, than the Lytton with all its structure.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. We kidded about should we be
Yeah, it
tasting
should've
it
been at the
first,
front, yeah.
before the Lytton, because you see that structure. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Right after this, the little shindig that we're doing here, I'm off to Pagani because that's the one vineyard, Zinfandel vineyard we haven't harvested yet. So I'll
So
be
we might
looking at
pick
that.
tomorrow?
Might
Or
pick
we
tomorrow.
might pick
Might pick on
Monday.
Monday. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay. And
we hope tomorrow.
where are the bricks at right now?
It's
They're-
so hard to say.
Yeah, I think with a little bit of rain that we got a couple days ago, they'll probably soak to 25 plus. So it just depends on what the rot situation is, if there is any, and how much the rain diluted the flavors. So we'll have a hard look at that and then make our decision.
Okay. Good. All right. Well,
Dr. John.
yeah. So the fourth wine lineup is our estate from Lytton, the Petite Sirah. So why don't we? David, you want to kick that one off?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So up until 2009 or so, until we had planted some new blocks. All the Petite Sirah was kind of consumed by the Lytton Springs here in Dry Creek. Yeah, but yes, and but by then we'd worked hard at identifying a few blocks and planting some more Petite Sirah so that we were able to do a consistent small national release of Petite Sirah, because what we find in Dry Creek Valley is the Petite Sirah is distinctive and it will age beautifully. The O2 is very young still. It's which is the first year we made a small amount of this wine separate, and we see great potential for it. So we're very, very excited about it. It's a funny grape because it can be very productive, especially when it's young, and yet it can be very susceptible. It's got very thin skins. It can be susceptible to sunburn. So in 2013, we actually had a much larger crop until 1 or 2 hot days where we'd call it nature's thinning, lost about 20%. But it added to the complexity, I think, of the wine. And it also doesn't take much to extract the color and body needed in these wines, so the fermentations are usually fairly short and fairly warm on these wines.
And John, that sort of leads into how you handle this wine, delicately.
Yeah, very carefully. No, but it certainly is the challenge with Petite Sirah is you can't have too much of a good thing, and it has lots of color, lots of tannin. And that can, quickly, become excessive in the fermenter if you're not keeping an eye on it. So it's really about, tasting it daily and, deciding at what point, do we have the balance that we're looking for, and then, get it off the skins and press it.
And not to consider extended maceration.
No, I don't think so. Not for this grape.
Yeah.
6 months.
Oh, I know.
I love the way this wine's tasting right now. It's got the big tannins, they're chalky, they're well coated, and you get a lot of those Rhone Syrah character, a lot of that black licorice and anise right now. Beautiful spice. It's really terrific. I mean, this is a wine we're committed to. It's really our newest national release, and we're continuing to plant, David, more Petite Sirah, and this is a program we plan to expand.
Yes, we have another 6 or so acres that will be budded next year.
So from a perspective of a wholesaler and all that, I mean, this is a wine to get behind. This is a wine we're going to see grow over time. So it's we're super pleased with the quality, and we're super pleased the way it's been received in the market. So moving on to our fifth wine is the 2012 Monte Bello. Eric, this is a wine obviously you made. It's a special vintage. It's our 50th anniversary vintage, the 1962 to 2012. So that's certainly something special right there. And then the vintage itself, 2012, was something special as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the first year of drought to hit the vineyards, but with water resources that were carried over from the 2 prior wet years, 10 and 11. So the vines actually made it through just fine. The yields weren't exceptionally large, for whatever reason during bloom. The yields were knocked back just slightly.
Yep.
And then we had this hot summer. So it was just like the perfect growing season to get really fully ripe grapes. We did have to rush and pick, though. That was the one thing. As the grapes all the parcels were beginning to ripen, they were all ripening at the same time. So fortunately, we were finishing up with the Zinfandel harvest up here, so we were able to get the entire picking teams of Sonoma down to Monte Bello to join the Monte Bello crew and do some massive picking. I mean, normally, we're doing 6 to 10 tons a day.
Well, that's the beauty
which
of
is
Monte Bello. We have multiple elevations, multiple aspects, and so you can pick and choose and do a block here, a block there as it gets ripe. This in 2012,
we didn't have that option. We just had to get in and just start clearing it all off quickly to avoid overripeness. But even so, as it came in, you look at the average bricks for this vintage, it's 25.
Right.
That's on the high side. That's getting close to where we were with the 2001, the one vintage where we crossed 14.
You still managed to keep it under 14.
Yeah.
It's
By
13
rapid, by
just getting in, getting it off, and getting it fermented carefully. It was also really tannic year. So
Okay.
the macerations were short. The amount of pump overs that we were giving, was reduced, and virtually all the press wine was held out. We just,
didn't
other
need
than
it.
just
So
a
structured.
tiny amount added in, but really in the end, it was a big, well-structured Montebello with good acid. I mean, that's why we wrote in here. I mean, it's going to drink well over the next 50 years.
It's a bold statement.
It is, but it's just one of those really powerful vintages.
And so, David, for example, in California in general,
Yes.
Napa and the rest of California, 12 was a good vintage, but a lot of those people felt that 13 was just the ideal vintage.
Sure, we're hearing that.
We think that 12 is right there. 13 is, yes,
Yeah,
phenomenal
13 's pretty
vintage.
amazing, yeah.
But for us, 12 is right there. Different in style, but as far as overall quality, by keeping it in the 13s instead of going to 14.5 or 15 or something, it is an incredibly beautiful vintage, very complex for us. So we think we don't look at 13 as being that much above or different from
13 's
12.
just totally different in terms of the mix of grapes selected. I mean, this is actually on the low side of cab.
yeah.
It's because,
64.
the Merlot, the Franc, Petit Verdot got fully ripe and made amazing wine, so we selected it.
So in some ways, a little more complexity with the other varieties playing a bigger
definitely.
role with the
Yeah.
12.
Oh, yeah.
And the 13, a little bit more cab dominant vintage.
Yeah, classic Montebello, the 80% cab. Well, what's unique of the 13 is that there's very little Merlot. I mean, that was the year the drought really had an effect on the vines.
On the Merlot vines.
Whereas here at 12, I mean, everything did a pretty nice job of getting to full ripeness. And
Franc is up at 8%
Yeah,
instead of
that's-
our traditional 3% or
3%.
nothing.
Yeah.
So, with some of our new Franc blocks, or one of them,
Yeah.
Franc has become an element in the Montebello. So you see it in the 12.
yeah.
So we received a question with next year being the 40th anniversary of the Judgment of Paris. Paul, do you believe there'll be another reenactment or any type of celebration of that anniversary, or do you have any?
Well, it's possible. We know that virtually all of the wines have really started to go south. We think the 91 at 12.2 alcohol is
The 71.
is 71, excuse me, is holding beautifully. So if anyone were willing to do a reenactment with the original bottles, we wouldn't mind. But I tend to doubt it. I think that both the Bordeaux's, mainly 70s, and the other Californians, really, it would not be that interesting to do it.
Okay. I think this might be interesting. Just take a moment to talk about an agreement that Ridge concluded earlier this year with the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District. This was an agreement that was first envisioned by the district, I think, more than 40 years ago. And an agreement that our president, Mark Vernon, who's behind the camera here today, worked more than a decade on, but it was finally concluded earlier this year. Paul, could you maybe comment about the agreement itself and maybe what it means for Ridge in the future?
Sure. The open space district that surrounds us on, 3 sides, basically, 2,000 and some acres, their land manager came to me almost 40 years ago and said, you guys, your upper vineyards dominate so many of our hiking trails that we would really like to do a conservation easement with you in which we tie up the development rights on those parcels that overlook the open space, and we give you the agricultural rights on what were the Montebello vineyards in the 19th century, well, up through Prohibition, and even shortly thereafter, and had been vineyards for you and have been long since abandoned. And we agreed in principle. Neither of us pushed the idea. Mainly, we couldn't afford it, and 2, they knew that we were environmentalists, that we were supporters of the open space, and that we weren't going to do anything radical like building mega mansions on the corners of our vineyard. But about, Mark joined us 17 years ago, and I sort of talked to him about this about 15 years ago. We began to look at it again, and the open space was, of course, very interested. And for the last 10 years, as you said, Mark has put in enormous number of hours, because to do any kind of an arrangement with a public district, it has to be absolutely fair for both. Well, it has to be absolutely fair for a public district. And of course, for us, it has to be fair as well. So it's taken a long time. And just in 2 stages, December and early part of this year, we concluded. So we now have another 30, how many?
Job security.
No, well.
Yeah, 30 good 30 plus acres that can be planted, and it's set to be staged out. So many acres planted over every 4 years to conserve the water resources that are available to us. And it's exciting because we've done a lot of work in the last decade looking at doing some replanting at our Rooston property, looking at selections, getting our Fountain Grove Cabernet cleaned up and back to us. So I'm really looking forward to planting some of that old historic vineyard.
But over the, next 20 years?
Yeah.
Yes, at least
so
20 years.
slowly.
So
it's
slow increase. I'm afraid.
Like everything
but
in the
the
wine
first-
business and at Ridge, it's a long-term project. Right?
Yeah, but the good news,
Eventually we'll
David,
get there.
the first 3 phases are relatively large acreages. That takes up the majority of the acres.
And I think the long-term estimates are at the end of the project when it's planted out, that this, between the Estate Cabernet and the Monte Bello, this could add 5,000 cases of additional production to Monte Bello. So this is good news for the future, I think, for all of us, because I know we all feel like we could, the demand and the interest in Monte Bello far exceeds our ability to produce wine at this point. So this is really, really terrific news, it's going to be a big part of our future at Ridge over the next 20 years, for sure. So it's an exciting project. And just to plug for our newsletter, this when it is going out about this time to all of our customers, to all of our distributors as well. And there's an article on the interior about the open space and with maps about the planting and all of that, which is interesting to read, as well as a great cover article by Paul on the 50th vintage of Monte Bello as well. So just a plug for that. But I think that's it for now. Yeah. I want to thank all of the production team for joining us today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your flexibility and ability to hop over to YouTube to join us this morning. And good luck with the fall releases, and have a great holiday season. We'll look forward to seeing you in the spring. Appreciate it.